The studio lights burned hot that morning, casting a pale sheen over the polished desk where the hosts of Morning Joe sat waiting. The cameras blinked red, the producers whispered into headsets, and the air hummed with that electric tension that only live television can create. You could almost taste it, like static on the tongue, a charge before the storm. Senator John Kennedy walked in slowly, not rushing, not shrinking either. He was a man who carried the kind of presence that didn't come from volume or theatrics, but from a deep, old-world steadiness. His gray hair was neat, his suit sharp but not flashy, his eyes, half tired, half sharp, seemed to cut through the bright lights and into the bones of anyone who dared to meet them. He moved with the unhurried pace of someone who'd seen storms rise and fall before, someone who knew that real power was not in bluster but in patience. For the hosts, this was supposed to be a victory lap. The night before, they'd run a segment mocking Kennedy's folksy manner of speaking. His metaphors about chickens, crawfish, and dogs in the backyard. They'd laughed, rolled their eyes, and framed him as little more than a relic, a caricature from Louisiana. They expected him to arrive defensive, cornered, scrambling to justify himself. But John Kennedy wasn't made of that cloth. When he sat down, he adjusted the mic on his lapel with slow precision. His hands were steady, his posture upright, like a man ready for a trial or maybe even a duel. Joe Scarborough leaned forward first, a smile that was less warmth than it was a mask. "Senator," he began, his tone polite but laced with challenge, "last night you said something that, frankly, a lot of Americans might find outdated, even offensive. Don't you think you're out of touch with where the country is heading?" Kennedy didn't flinch. He looked at Joe with a kind of grandfatherly patience, the way an old teacher might look at a student asking a question he should have already known the answer to. Then he spoke, his voice measured, with the faintest southern drawl that rolled like a slow river. "Well, Joe," he said, "I think what's out of touch is the idea that the American people can't tell when they're being talked down to." The words hung heavy in the air. The studio quieted. Mika shifted in her chair, trying to disguise the discomfort that spread across her face. That was the opening volley. What followed was not just an interview. It was a dismantling. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't spit insults or pound the table. Instead, he laid out truths in plain, human language, each sentence landing like a stone in still water, ripples spreading wider and wider. But the story wasn't just about a verbal sparring match on live television. It was about two clashing visions of America, one polished and curated for urban coffee shops and editorial boards, the other rooted in backyards, church pews, and diner counters. And it was about the man caught in the middle of it all, carrying both the weight of his upbringing and the pressure of his present. John Kennedy had grown up poor in Louisiana, the son of a small-town family that knew what it was to live paycheck to paycheck. He had carried books home from the public library because they couldn't afford to buy them. His first suit had been second-hand, but he'd also been hungry, not for food, though that too sometimes, but for knowledge, for dignity, for the chance to make something more of himself. His dreams had been forged in the mud and the heat of the South, and while he had climbed the steps of Oxford and the halls of the Senate, he never forgot the dirt roads that raised him. That was why his metaphors sounded the way they did. Not polished academic arguments, but the kind of wisdom you could carry in your pocket, the kind your grandmother whispered over fried chicken on Sunday afternoons. And he knew the audience at home understood him, even if the hosts in front of him pretended not to. But Kennedy wasn't without his fears. Deep down, he worried that America was moving so fast it might lose its anchor, that the values of honesty, grit, and community might be drowned out by sound bites, hashtags, and hollow performances. Sitting across from Joe and Mika, he wondered if this very interview might be another moment where truth was twisted into theater. And yet, he felt the quiet fire of resolve in his chest today he would not bend. The interview swelled. Joe tried to pivot, pressing him about policy details, throwing numbers like darts. Kennedy responded not with spreadsheets, but with stories. About the farmer in Ruston whose crops had failed, about the single mother in Baton Rouge working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Every story was a mirror held up to the studio, forcing them to see not just statistics but people. Subplot 1 emerged in these stories, the lives of ordinary Louisianans, woven into Kennedy's argument like threads of living proof. Their struggles became part of the battle in that studio, their voices speaking through him. The second subplot lived within Kennedy himself. As he spoke, he remembered his father's words. "Son, never confuse intelligence with wisdom. A wise man listens before he talks." And Kennedy realized this wasn't just about winning a televised debate. It was about reminding America that wisdom could wear plain clothes, that truth didn't need a teleprompter. The tension built. At one point, Joe raised his voice, leaning in so close the camera caught the sweat on his brow. "Senator, are you saying you know better than the experts?" Kennedy paused. The silence was thick. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "No, Joe. I'm saying the experts don't always know better than the people living it." That line cracked something open. The control of the interview shifted in that instant, like a tide turning. You could feel the momentum swing. The producers in the control room exchanged glances. Mika's smile faltered. The studio, so full of noise and certainty at the start, now felt like a church in confession. But here's where the emotional undercurrent pulled strongest. As Kennedy spoke, his voice caught for just a second. Not in weakness, but in the rawness of memory. He talked about his mother, who had cleaned houses to help pay for his schooling. He talked about standing in the grocery store line as a boy, watching her count pennies with trembling hands, praying she had enough for bread and milk. "I'll tell you what out of touch is," he said softly. "It's never having to know that feeling. And it's mocking the way a man talks instead of listening to the truth behind his words." The studio fell silent. The climax came not with shouting, but with stillness. Kennedy leaned back, folded his hands, and let the weight of his words do the work. Joe tried to recover, but the fight was gone. Mika looked down at her notes, lips pressed tight. The destruction was complete. Not because Kennedy had humiliated them, but because he had revealed them. And yet, the resolution wasn't bitterness. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't spike the ball in victory. Instead, he offered something unexpected: compassion. "I don't blame you," he said finally. "The world teaches us to laugh before we listen, but I believe most folks, deep down, still know the sound of truth when they hear it. My job isn't to sound like them or like you. My job is to sound like me and to fight for the people who can't be in this studio to speak for themselves." By the end, the lesson was clear. Strength isn't in sharp tongues or perfect polish. It's in authenticity, in holding fast to where you came from, in remembering that power is borrowed from the people who trust you. When Kennedy stood to leave, he buttoned his jacket, nodded politely, and walked out without a backward glance. The studio lights still burned, but they no longer belonged to the hosts. They belonged to the man who had walked in steady and walked out unshaken. And for everyone watching at home, the single mothers, the farmers, the workers forgotten by headlines. It wasn't just an interview. It was a reminder. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truth.